Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
The house is in Melanie's name. That's the sentence that spun in my ears while I stared across the table at our family lawyer. I thought I'd misheard him. I blinked, maybe even tilted my head like a confused dog, and waited for someone to say it was a mistake, or a joke, or that there were still details to sort out. But no one said anything. My sister Melanie beamed like she just won a sweepstakes. Dean, her husband, clapped her back and whispered something smug into her ear. And I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, nodding like the good daughter I had been my whole life. I didn't say a damn thing. See, when I was 15, my mom once told me after I helped clean up a flood-damaged garage that helping family isn't something you brag about. She said it with pride, like it was the backbone of what made us strong Southern women. We show up, we get things done, and we don't expect a trophy or a round of applause. I took that to heart. It stuck with me longer than she probably meant it to. So when Mom called me crying 2 years ago because the mortgage was behind, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask questions. I just wired over $4,000 and told her to take a breath. It happened again 6 months later, and then one more time last summer. I'd never asked for it back. Never even told anyone. Not even my ex-husband, and we were still friendly back then. I wasn't keeping track because I wanted to be repaid. I was keeping track because I had been raised to do the right thing quietly. You help family, you shut your mouth, and you go back to your own life. But here I was, sitting in an office smelling like old books and wood polish, watching my sister accept full ownership of our mother's home like it was her birthright. There had been no conversation, no explanation, just a legal document signed, sealed, and blessed with Mom's dying wish, as Melanie called it. The weirdest part? Everyone acted like it made perfect sense. My aunt nodded approvingly. The lawyer glanced at me only briefly, as if to check whether I'd throw a fit or quietly accept it. My cousin Jenny, bless her, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I wanted to speak up. I really did. But I could still hear Mom's voice in my head. Helping family isn't something you brag about. And somehow, in the moment, speaking up felt like bragging. It felt like telling on someone. It felt wrong. So I said, "That's nice, Melanie. I'm glad the house is staying in the family." Melanie beamed. Dean leaned back in his chair like he'd just closed a major business deal. "It's what your mom wanted," he said. Like he'd been the one holding her hand in hospice those last 2 weeks. Like he was family. He wasn't there for the nights Mom couldn't sleep, when she needed me to spoon soup into her mouth or rub her back during the coughing fits. Melanie always had an excuse. Kids' soccer games, a scheduling conflict, or Dean and I need some us time. I didn't say anything. I walked out of that office with my coat still buttoned to the top, like I was protecting myself from more than just the February wind. My boots echoed on the pavement, and I drove home in silence. Didn't even turn on the radio. You ever get that feeling like you've been mugged in broad daylight, but the cops would just tell you to get over it because it was your own sister? That's how it felt. Like something was taken from me. No, more like something I'd given in good faith had been twisted and handed to someone who didn't earn it. I kept thinking about the checks I wrote, the late-night transfers, the repairs I paid for out of pocket. I remembered the roof leak I patched myself, the plumber I called, the contractor I argued with when he tried to overcharge my mother. Melanie wasn't there for any of it, but she sure as hell showed up when there was a deed being handed out. That night I sat on my couch with a glass of cheap red wine and stared at the television, not really watching. I wasn't angry yet. Not really, I was numb, confused, a little betrayed, but mostly I was embarrassed. Embarrassed that I'd let myself be that gullible, that quiet, that obedient. Dean called me 2 days later just to rub salt in the wound. He said, "Hey Jackie, we're thinking of repainting the front porch. What color do you think would look good?" I nearly choked. I said something polite, something like, "Maybe a nice sage green," and hung up before my voice cracked. The porch I power washed last summer. The one I re-nailed the steps on after a storm. They wanted my opinion on the color, but not my name on the deed. I think that was the first moment I felt something stir in me. Not rage, not revenge. Just a sharp, cold clarity, like a window being opened in a stuffy room. It didn't all click then, but something had shifted. The next morning, I pulled out a manila folder I hadn't looked at in months. Inside were receipts, wire transfers, a few handwritten notes from Mom, thanking me. One even said, "I don't know what I'd do without you. Melanie's got too much going on." I stared at that note for a long time. I could have gone off right then, could have called Melanie, screamed at Dean, made a mess. But I didn't. I didn't want drama. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. I just wanted to make sure I had all my paperwork in order. And when I closed that folder, I smiled. But something inside me broke. I didn't know it then, but that smile would be the last thing I'd give them for free. When we were kids, Melanie had a way of floating above the consequences of her actions like she had some invisible cushion keeping her from ever hitting the ground. She'd crash Dad's car at 17 and cry until Mom blamed the brakes. She'd skip school, lie about it, and somehow I'd be the one grounded for setting a bad example. I used to think I just had bad luck, but by the time we were adults, I realized I was just raised to be responsible, and she was raised to be adored. It was always Melanie's world. We just lived in it. Growing up in a small Georgia town where people still believed the first daughter carried the weight and the second got the grace, I didn't question it. I kept my head down, did what was expected, and eventually moved into a small apartment above a feed store when I turned 23 and needed to get out. Meanwhile, Melanie floated through college and 3 different majors without ever finishing one. Mom said, "She'll find her way. She's just got to bloom on her own time." I always wondered how long a woman could stay in the seedling phase before someone called it what it was: stalling. Fast forward to now, and I'm 44, twice divorced, no kids, steady job, and one aging tabby cat named Donut, who's about as emotionally available as I am. Melanie, 38, 2 kids she barely manages to shuttle to school, and married to Dean, the kind of man who thinks being right is more important than being useful. He's the guy who shows up to family dinners with a Bluetooth in his ear and tells you how hard he works, while explaining that women just don't understand business. You know the type. After the house was handed over to Melanie, I told myself to let it go. I really did. I told myself Mom must have had her reasons, maybe wanted to give Melanie a chance to finally grow up, to anchor her in one place. But then I found out what they were planning to do with the place, and any sense of peace I had was gone in an instant. It started with a photo on Facebook. Melanie posted a picture of the backyard with the caption, "Saying goodbye to old memories, big things coming." It was the same yard where we used to chase lightning bugs and where Mom would hang laundry, even when she could afford the dryer. I ignored it, but then a few days later, my cousin Jenny called me. Jenny doesn't gossip unless something's really eating at her. She said she'd heard from someone that Melanie and Dean were planning to flip the house, not live in it, not honor it. Just sell it and use the profit to buy a lakefront fixer-upper 2 counties over. "They said the market's hot," Jenny whispered, like we were talking about a crime. "They're selling Mom's house?" I asked, trying not to let the words lodge in my throat. "Jackie, they said it's theirs now. Full ownership. You didn't know?" I thanked her, hung up, and sat in the dark kitchen for over an hour, watching the clock and letting my thoughts chew on each other. I remembered the nights I drove over in the rain to fix a leaky faucet or change a blown fuse. I remembered when Mom fell and couldn't get up, and I had to break in through the back door because Melanie didn't answer her phone for 6 hours. I remembered how many weekends I gave up, how much money I pulled from my own retirement fund to keep Mom from defaulting. $12,000 isn't pocket change for someone like me. That's years of peace I'd bought for her. Now it was about to become profit for someone who hadn't paid a single bill. But the real blow came when I found out why the deed was in Melanie's name. It wasn't Mom's dying wish like they said. It wasn't even something I'd been left out of. According to Jenny, Dean had told the lawyer I refused my part, that I didn't want the responsibility. They had told him I said I was too busy with work and didn't want to be tied down. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a lie. A slick, confident lie that slipped out of Dean's mouth with the ease of someone who'd told 1,000 just like it. And Melanie? She let it happen, probably nodded and smiled and acted like it made perfect sense. That was when the numbness left me. That was when something sharp replaced it, something cold and calculating and patient. I didn't throw things or scream into a pillow. I didn't start calling relatives or writing long Facebook posts. What I did was simple. I opened the drawer where I kept all my paperwork, and I pulled out the old receipts again. This time, I didn't just look at them. I started organizing them. I made copies. I added sticky notes and dates. I printed bank statements and lined them up in order. And then I picked up my phone and called someone I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Gary Sanders, my ex-husband's lawyer. We hadn't ended things badly, Gary and I. Our divorce was quiet, civilized, but I remembered how ruthless Gary could be in the courtroom. He once made a man cry over lawn furniture. I told him what happened in brief, not wanting to give too much away until I knew what my options were. Gary listened without interrupting. When I finished, he took a long breath and said, "Jackie, I'm going to be honest. That doesn't sound like family. That sounds like they stole your investment and called it a gift." I didn't say anything. I just waited. He continued, "If you've got proof of those payments, and if they misrepresented your wishes to that lawyer, we can do something about this. Not loud, not messy, but effective." I smiled. This time it wasn't bitter. It wasn't broken. It was the kind of smile you give yourself when you realize you've got more power than they think you do. I didn't want the whole house. I just wanted what I paid for. And if they didn't want to give it to me, well, then they could learn what happens when the quiet one finally speaks up. By the time I drove to Gary's office, the early spring air had turned sharp and wet. The kind of gray that seeps into your sleeves and makes you feel like the whole world is trying to nudge you back into your shell. But I didn't retreat. I sat in his office, surrounded by polished wood, dustless bookshelves, and a clock that ticked a little too loud, and I laid out every document I had on the table between us with a kind of calm that surprised even me. I watched as his eyebrows slowly lifted with each bank transfer, each scanned check, each screenshot of text messages between me and Mom. Those little notes where she thanked me for helping again, where she promised she'd make it right one day. Gary took his glasses off, set them on the table, and rubbed the side of his jaw. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "They played you, Jackie, but they're not going to get away with it." Now I hadn't walked into that office looking for vengeance. Not really. What I wanted was fairness. I wanted accountability. I wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge that what they did wasn't just inconsiderate, but dishonest. And Gary, thank God, knew exactly how to deliver that without lighting the whole thing on fire. He explained something called a constructive trust, a legal maneuver used when someone benefits unjustly from assets or funds provided by someone else, even if no formal agreement was made at the time. He said, "You didn't gift them this money. You preserved that home with the expectation that it remained part of the family, not a windfall for your sister and her husband to cash in on. And with what I'm seeing here, we can argue that your contributions created equitable interest in the property. That gives you legal standing." I didn't say anything at first. I just stared down at the copies I'd spread out, realizing that all those little pieces of paper, the ones I'd kept out of habit more than purpose, had suddenly become ammunition. It was a strange feeling to know that my silence all these years hadn't left me powerless. It had left me prepared. That night, I went home and did something I hadn't done in months. I slept through the night, no tossing, no waking up with that tight, sinking feeling in my stomach. Just 8 solid hours of sleep, like my body finally got the memo that I wasn't alone anymore. In the days that followed, Gary drafted the legal claim, attaching every receipt, every digital trail of proof, and filed it quietly with the court. What people don't realize is that legal power doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it moves like a shadow, slow, steady, and absolutely impossible to stop once it gets going. The day Melanie and Dean received the notice, I wasn't there, but I heard all about it from Jenny, who lived a few blocks over and had been keeping an eye on things. According to her, Melanie went full meltdown mode, called half the family, cried to anyone who would listen, and swore I was trying to destroy her life. Dean, on the other hand, tried to downplay the whole thing, saying it was just a misunderstanding and that Jackie's confused. He even tried to call me. I didn't pick up. Instead, I sent one message, typed neatly and without emotion. All communication can go through my attorney. His contact information is below. It felt cold, sure, but sometimes cold is the only thing that keeps your spine straight when everyone's trying to bend you back into place. They thought I'd roll over. They thought I'd stay quiet. But they forgot something essential about people like me, the ones who carry the weight, who don't make a fuss, who always do the right thing even when no one's watching. We don't yell, we don't threaten, we keep records. 2 weeks after the notice was served, I got an email from Gary with a single line. The property has been frozen. They can't sell or refinance without resolving the claim. I stared at that sentence for a long while, feeling a rush of satisfaction that wasn't quite happiness. It was something heavier, something deeper. I wasn't trying to ruin their lives. I wasn't even trying to hurt them. But I was done being the one who got left behind, while they smiled and waved and walked off with what I'd worked for. What made the whole thing even more surreal was that while all this legal maneuvering was happening, Melanie had decided to throw a little get-together at the house. She posted pictures of string lights, a new welcome mat, a fresh coat of paint on the porch, sage green, which was either petty or oblivious. I couldn't tell. It looked like she was trying to prove something, but I knew better. The more she decorated, the more desperate it all looked. They were trying to sell the image of a home, a happy life, a new start, while ignoring the foundation it was built on, me. 3 weeks to the day after the claim was filed, I drove up the familiar road, pulled into the driveway I used to shovel in the winter, and walked up to the house I helped save from foreclosure more times than they even knew. There were lawn chairs on the porch, empty beer bottles from the night before, and wind chimes clinking in the breeze. I knocked once, and when the door opened, Dean was standing there in shorts and a stained t-shirt, looking like he'd just come back from a jog or a nap. He blinked at me like I was a ghost. "Jackie?" he said, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Hey, what brings you by?" I handed him the envelope. "I'm not staying," I said calmly. "Just need to give this to you." He opened it right there on the porch, and I swear I watched the blood drain from his face. He didn't say anything, just stood there flipping through pages with trembling fingers, like he couldn't quite believe what he was reading. And I didn't gloat. I didn't smirk. I just turned and walked away. Because revenge isn't always a firestorm. Sometimes it's just a quiet knock on the door with a manila envelope. And sometimes the look on someone's face when they realize you were never as soft as they thought you were is worth more than any dramatic scene could ever be. The thing about Dean is that he never expected anyone to push back, least of all someone like me. To him, I was background noise. A woman who showed up when needed, nodded at the right times, and disappeared when the conversation turned to anything that required asserting yourself. That's why when I handed him that envelope and turned away without so much as a raised voice, it hit him harder than any confrontation ever could have. He didn't know it then, but what I'd given him wasn't just a letter. It was a chain on the property they'd planned to cash in on, and it would stay there until I was either paid back or made whole. Within 24 hours, I got a call from Gary. He sounded amused in that way lawyers do when they know they've set a slow-burning fuse. "They've retained counsel," he said, which didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was what came next. Their attorney tried to brush this off as a family misunderstanding, said it was a communication issue. I reminded him that misunderstandings don't typically come with paper trails, and then I emailed over all the documentation. The best part? That documentation wasn't just numbers on a page. It was dates. It was timestamps. It was my mother's own words thanking me. It was the text where Melanie asked me if I could float Mom a little help, because Dean says we're tight this month. It was evidence that they'd been more than willing to accept my help as long as it came without expectation. The moment I asked for recognition, suddenly it became an attack. The next time Melanie called, I didn't answer. I let it ring and then ring again. Eventually, she left a voicemail that started with her crying and ended with her calling me selfish. According to her, I was ripping the family apart, and I wouldn't understand because I didn't have kids to think about. That last line stuck with me. It wasn't just petty, it was calculated. She knew exactly where to stick the knife, but I wasn't 14 anymore, hoping to be liked. I wasn't even 30, trying to be the better person. I was 44, and I'd had enough of carrying the guilt for other people's laziness. So I saved the voicemail, added it to the case file, and went on with my day. 2 days later, I received an official response from their side. They were offering to pay me back, kind of. The number they proposed was $6,000, not even half of what I'd put into the house, not counting inflation, interest, or the fact that they'd already listed the house at over $300,000 with a local real estate agent. It was a slap in the face dressed up as a peace offering. Gary asked if I wanted to counter. I told him no. Let them twist, I said. Let them sweat. And sweat they did. Within a week, the real estate listing was pulled, and I heard from Jenny that Dean had started ranting at family events about Jackie's little legal tantrum. He called me bitter, accused me of jealousy, and implied that I was trying to punish Melanie because I had nothing going on in my life. It would have hurt years ago, now it was just predictable. Dean needed me to be the villain in the story, because if I wasn't, he'd have to admit he'd built his little kingdom on someone else's sacrifice. That weekend, I went to the house again, not to fight, not to talk, but to document. I took pictures of the property, the renovations they'd started without my consent, and the for sale sign they had quietly removed. Every detail went into the file, which was now thick enough to thud when Gary dropped it on his desk. They tried again the next week, this time offering $10,000. I didn't respond. That was when Dean made his biggest mistake. He sent me a letter through their lawyer implying that I had no legal right to a portion of the property, and that if I didn't drop the claim, they would sue me for harassment and legal costs. Gary just laughed when he read it. "That's not how this works," he said. And then he sent back a 30-page rebuttal, complete with receipts, annotated records, and a list of witness statements, Jenny included, confirming that Melanie and Dean had known full well that I'd covered those mortgage payments with the understanding that the house was part of a shared family legacy. After that, the tone shifted. Melanie stopped calling, Dean stopped posturing, and for the first time in months, I could feel the tide turning. They couldn't sell. They couldn't borrow against the house. They couldn't even legally renovate it without my sign-off. The thing about paper, real paper, not handshakes and memories, is that it never forgets. People can spin stories, rewrite history, and cry to the right audience, but the ink stays put. And now that I had put everything in writing, they couldn't wriggle out of it without facing real consequences. Jenny called one evening and told me Melanie was losing sleep. "She said you blindsided her," she whispered, like we were kids again trading secrets under blankets. I just smiled and said, "I was never hiding. She just never bothered to look." What Melanie had underestimated wasn't my willingness to fight, it was my patience. She assumed I'd let it go because I'd always let things go. But helping family isn't about turning the other cheek until there's nothing left of your face. Helping family doesn't mean being erased. Eventually, I knew they'd have to come to the table. They were boxed in, and they knew it. The house wasn't theirs to do with as they pleased. Not while I held the keys to the part they hadn't paid for. Dean tried one more tactic. He called Jenny and asked her to convince me to settle quietly, for the sake of peace. He said it was just money, and that family should be able to work things out without dragging it through the courts. That would have carried more weight if he hadn't started this by lying to a lawyer. I told Jenny to tell him this. "You don't get to act like I'm part of the family when it's convenient, then cut me out when it counts. Either he pays what's owed, or we see this through to the very last filing." By now, even Jenny admitted it was fair. "You were right to do this," she said. "I just wish it didn't have to get so ugly." But sometimes it does. Sometimes it has to. Sometimes people need to learn that not everyone who stays quiet is weak. Sometimes paper cuts the deepest. By the time May rolled in with its thick, humid air and cicadas screaming from the trees, the dust had started to settle, or at least, it seemed like it wanted to. Melanie had gone quiet, which in itself was louder than any tantrum she could have thrown, and Dean, who once strutted around like the king of the cul-de-sac, had been spotted mowing the lawn with the kind of posture that belongs to a man who just found out there are rules in this world that even he can't talk his way out of. I wasn't celebrating, not exactly, but I was enjoying the peace that came with knowing that no matter how many phone calls they made, no matter how many times they tried to twist the narrative, the legal system had finally acknowledged what they couldn't. That my silence hadn't meant consent, and that being the dependable daughter didn't mean I was expendable. They stopped trying to negotiate through back channels once the second appraisal came in. The house, even after Melanie's half-hearted attempts at renovation, was worth more than $320,000. And that number made something click for Dean, or maybe it just knocked the wind out of him. All that effort to secure the deed, all that smug confidence when they strutted out of the lawyer's office, and now it was useless unless I signed off. They needed my cooperation to sell. They needed my permission to refinance. They needed the one person they had dismissed as irrelevant to move forward. I received an email directly from their attorney, no sugarcoating this time, just a clean, formal offer. Either they would buy me out at the full value of my documented contribution, plus legal fees, or they would add me to the deed as a 1/3 owner, with full voting rights on any decisions related to the property. It wasn't an apology, and it sure as hell wasn't a reconciliation, but it was surrender, and in a situation like this, that meant everything. I chose the second option. I didn't want a payout. I didn't want a check with Dean's smug signature in the corner. I wanted something that would last longer than money. I wanted to be in the room every time they wanted to make a decision. I wanted them to remember my name every time they thought about the house. I wanted to own my piece, not just of the property, but of the history they tried to erase me from. So we signed the agreement. My name was added to the deed, and from that moment on, I made it clear. I wouldn't be moving in. I wouldn't be attending family dinners on that porch. I wouldn't be sitting in the living room during holidays, acting like it hadn't taken a legal battle to get here. What I did instead was hire a property manager and lease my share of the house, specifically the basement unit, which Dean had turned into a short-term rental, to a traveling nurse who needed a 6-month lease and didn't mind the lingering family tension upstairs. The rent didn't make me rich, but every time I saw that direct deposit hit my account, it felt like a tiny restoration of balance. Every dollar reminded me that fairness might come late, but when it arrives, it tastes better than revenge. Still, I won't lie. There was something deeply satisfying about the way Dean avoided my gaze. The one time I crossed paths with him afterward, while I was doing a walkthrough with the property manager, he nodded, muttered something that might have been a greeting or an apology, and hurried past like I might set fire to the porch if I stood there too long. Melanie never said a word, not once, not even a text, not a thank you, not a sorry, nothing. I don't think she ever will. But here's the thing. I stopped needing it. I stopped waiting for her to become someone who sees people beyond what they can provide. People like Melanie survive by convincing themselves they deserve everything they take. And people like me, we survive by learning to stop handing things over for free. That summer, I took a trip I'd been putting off for over a decade. Italy, just me, a carry-on, and 6 days with no itinerary. I ate my way through tiny towns, drank wine that tasted like sunshine, and stood on quiet cobblestone streets thinking about all the years I spent making myself smaller for the comfort of others. I thought about my mother too, not with bitterness, but with the strange tenderness that comes when you realize someone raised you to be strong without meaning to. She told me not to brag about helping family, but she never said I had to let them trample me for it. I think if she lived long enough to see what happened, she might have finally said the words I never got to hear. You were right to fight. On the flight home, somewhere over the Atlantic, I wrote out a letter, not to Melanie, not to Dean, not even to Mom, just to myself. I wrote out every time I'd swallowed my pride, every time I'd stepped aside, every time I'd given something without expecting anything back. I wrote it down not as a list of grievances, but as a reminder that I had always shown up, that I had always kept my word, that I had done what was right even when no one noticed. And now that I had forced the world to notice, I wasn't going to shrink back into silence again. When I landed back in Georgia, I didn't go to the house. I didn't drive by it. I didn't think about who was on the porch or whether the chimes were still clinking in the wind. I had my share. I had my say. And that was enough. You see, they thought they were handing me nothing, but what they really gave me was clarity. And the next time someone tries to take what I've built, they can choke on the silence I'll leave behind.